From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Wednesday, February 11, 2026. Israeli President Isaac Herzog meets in Canberra today with Anthony Albanese. That's after Herzog accused the Labor government of not understanding Israel's right to self-defence, and Albanese got emotional while defending his decision to invite Herzog, who's from the opposition Labor Party in Israel, to Australia. In the background, the wash-up to violent protests. That's all live right now at theaustralian.com.au. China's accused of crushing Hong Kong's independence after a harsh sentence was handed down to publisher and democracy activist Jimmy Lai. Beijing blames Lai for years of increasingly violent dissent against the Chinese Communist Party. Today, we talk to the Australian's National Chief Correspondent Hedley Thomas, a veteran newsman who's reported in and on Hong Kong for years, about the road to this result. It sounds almost unbearably stark. A 78-year-old media publisher sentenced to 20 years in prison for national security offences.
Marking the most severe punishment yet under the city's national security law.
Security offences accused of publishing seditious material and colluding with foreign forces.
They sent 500 police officers to raid my father's newspaper.
20 years in prison, ending a high-profile case.
Jimmy Lai and 6 former executives of his now closed newspaper Apple Daily were this week jailed by a panel of judges in Hong Kong in what's being widely interpreted as a politically motivated prosecution. A death sentence for this old man and a sign of Beijing's crackdown on free speech on the island.
There has been international outcry after a Hong Kong court sentenced the pro-democracy media mogul and China critic Jimmy Lai to 20 years in prison.
The steamy, rugged, volcanic island of Hong Kong, now one of the most exciting and glamorous cities on earth, has been fought over for centuries. Originally part of China, it became a British colony in the 1840s, was occupied by Japan in World War II, and spent most of the 20th century as the last remnant of the British Empire. In 1997, Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. London and Beijing signed a deal that was supposed to guarantee that Hong Kong, by then a thriving centre of capitalism, would, for the next 50 years, be allowed a measure of independence from the Chinese mainland and its Communist Party government. They called it one country, two systems. But ever since 97, there's been building tension between the central government and Hong Kong. Demonstrations and growing signs that China's grip was tightening. Throughout the 2010s, the tension ratcheted up until in 2019 it exploded into violent protest.
A dangerous, almost daily struggle that sometimes ends like this.
The Australian's National Chief Correspondent Hedley Thomas is best known these days as one of the world's most revered investigative podcasters. But early in his journalism career, Hedley took the same path as a lot of Australian journos, off for a big adventure in the bright lights and vibrant media scene of Hong Kong. Hedley, what was Hong Kong's newspaper world like in the 90s?
Oh, it was absolutely fantastic, Claire. It was exciting. It was fast-paced. Journalists were relatively well paid. The South China Morning Post, where I worked with my then girlfriend, who became my wife, Ruth Matthewson, it was the most profitable English language newspaper in the world. And we had so much to cover. The lead up to the handover of Hong Kong from the British to China was, of course, uppermost in the minds of many of the journalists there and all of the expats and local Chinese. But there was so much other news breaking, incredible murders, bank and casino heists in Macau. We had corruption on an industrial scale in some parts of the government. These stories, and so many more like them, made Hong Kong such a wonderful place to be a reporter, to work in journalism, to meet fascinating people and enjoy one of the greatest cities in the world.
Did it feel when the handover was happening that this was the end of an era in Hong Kong?
Yes, it did. But there was also a great amount of hopefulness that Hong Kong, with a high degree of autonomy, would be able to continue to prosper, that free speech and freedom of the press and the rule of law would continue and continue for some decades. Now, there were always going to be constraints. China was in charge. That meant that the Chinese Communist Party was going to keep a very close eye on how events unfolded in Hong Kong. For a number of years, Hong Kong continued to outperform, to prosper, and the media was functioning, I would say, almost as vigorously as it had pre-handover. There were undoubtedly some punches pulled, some acts of self-censorship by some of the journalists. For those journalists who, unlike the expats who could leave Hong Kong with our foreign passports, local journalists were really stuck in Hong Kong. So they knew that for them, there could be repercussions if they went too far. But Hong Kong's media was for years really robust. There was intense questioning of the Hong Kong government for years after the handover, and that was a really good sign.
The Australian's Hedley Thomas is in Hong Kong and he joins me now.
In 2019, you went back to Hong Kong on assignment with your wife, journalist Ruth Mathewson, to report on protests that had turned shockingly violent.
Andrew, last night, the married quarters of the police where they live with their wives and children was attacked by a petrol bomb-wielding group of protesters. They've done this before in the married quarters, so effectively attempting to murder police. Today, there are still...
Those protests blew up over an extradition law. Prosecutors wanted to return a man accused of murdering his girlfriend to mainland China for trial.
The protesters are actually violently assaulting people who challenge them. If you are not with them, then you are an enemy, and they will retaliate, as you have seen.
At the time, Hedley, your reporting, as it so often does, went against the grain of a lot of other journalism about those protests at the time. What did you see at those 2019 protests?
There were acts of incredible violence and anarchy. There were hardline criminals who were leading those protest movements, and there was a degree of nihilism which we hadn't seen in Hong Kong protests before. One man splashed with lighter fluid and set alight, others violently bashed. Police attacked with box cutters. Some of the protesters were determined to try to seize police weapons. One was shot while trying to grab one officer's gun. There were so many acts like this, and the climate was dangerous. And I think for too long, Hong Kong police tolerated what was unfolding. They stayed back, and instead of trying to take charge, to take control and deter the protesters, they just stood by. It was a very weird time. The eyes of the world were on Hong Kong, of course, because the international media, journalists from all around the world had descended, and they were reporting on what for many journalists probably looked like some kind of rerun of the Tiananmen Square protests and subsequent massacre there. So the protesters were portrayed very misleadingly as these peaceful young students and the like who just wanted to see democracy in Hong Kong. From what we could see, nothing could be further from the truth. Many of the young protesters, no doubt, had that in mind, but there were these hardliners who appeared hell-bent on wanton destruction and violence.
Beijing's been tightening the screws ever since. In 2020, a law was introduced after those protests which criminalised a lot of forms of dissent which had previously been allowed or tolerated. Jimmy Lai was found guilty of colluding with foreign forces. That relates to conversations he was accused of having with American figures, including the former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the former Vice President Mike Pence, and National Security Advisor John Bolton. He was also convicted of sedition offences related to things that had been published in his newspaper, Apple Daily. To what extent do you think the violence of those 29 protests kind of precipitated that tougher or accelerated crackdown by Beijing?
The Chinese have an expression, kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. In Cantonese, it's sat gai geng hao. Jimmy Lai, the internationally renowned publisher, Hong Kong billionaire and success story, he is the chicken in this Chinese expression. And prosecuting him, it meant that the Chinese would be able to set a very powerful public example to the people of Hong Kong that acts of what the Chinese government would regard as sedition and subversion would not be tolerated. Jimmy Lai and his Apple Daily had undoubtedly gone further than any other Chinese media in the way that the Chinese Communist Party and its leaders were depicted. He was an outlier. His newspaper was the most popular in Hong Kong by a very big margin, and Apple Daily was the most aggressive. And with his high-level political meetings in the United States, with many of the stories that were published by Apple Daily, he was perceived by Beijing as a Hong Konger actively colluding with China's enemies for the overthrow of the national government. Beijing believed that Apple Daily and Jimmy Lai and their journalism were undermining Chinese rule and were fueling and encouraging these protests of 2019 and trying to achieve insurrection. The leadership in Beijing believed that he was being supported by foreign forces, probably Taiwan and parts of the United States. The CIA was suspected too. Now, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Doesn't mean that it wasn't occurring. We don't know whether the Chinese ever uncovered any evidence of it, but that was certainly a belief that was rife at the highest levels.
Coming up, more of my conversation with Hedley Thomas. Jimmy Lai is a big name in Hong Kong. He was born on the mainland, but fled to Hong Kong as a kid just as the Communist Party took power and rose from a factory worker to a wealthy fashion entrepreneur. He founded the label Giordano and became hugely successful. This is Lai in 2020, after his arrest, speaking to America's ABC News.
I came here with $1, escaped from China when I was 12. This place gave me everything. My reward is to pay back. It's my redemption.
You and I talk about journalism a lot, Hedley, and you really believe in free speech. You've won 2 gold Walkleys for stories that have really taken it to government or to prosecutors. What do you think about Jimmy Lai's case, just as a journalist?
Yeah, it's a really tough one, Claire, because the penalty that has been inflicted upon Jimmy Lai is crushing. He's likely to die behind bars. He was a very influential and popular, much loved publisher who did great things through a lot of the journalism that his publications produced. But at the same time, I can see how his visceral hatred of China and of the Chinese Communist Party and his belief that Hong Kong could somehow function entirely separately from China fed into journalism that indeed incited and encouraged very violent protests. Would the 2019 protests have been as destructive and as violent if Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily had not been encouraging and promoting the protests? That's a question that the judges in his trial must have grappled with. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that it's a genuine question. I think it's one that many journalists and certainly the overwhelming majority of media outlets try not to deal with, because we're used to free speech and being able to publish very freely. But would we be able to do that even in Australia if in our publications we were inciting people to rise up, to potentially overthrow our own government in a violent way, not through democracy, but through destruction and through public vandalism and violence?
You spoke about journos who you knew back in the late 90s who were already self-censoring. How do you think they will be feeling now that the one country, two systems idea doesn't really seem to be working?
Hong Kong didn't have true democracy under British rule before 1997. It enjoyed free speech, enjoyed free press and the rule of law. But there is no doubt that Hong Kong's once vibrant and fearless free press has gone. There's still press criticism of Hong Kong government failures and policies, but the tone is markedly different now. It's more muted. Journalists are consciously and subconsciously self-censoring. And I think that the intensity of the questioning by journalists of the Hong Kong government is a thing of the past. The media has been emasculated. It is no longer fearless. The national security law introduced in 2020 means people are treading carefully. I think that outcome was always an inevitability. How long it would take for that to occur after the 1997 handover, well, we didn't know. As it turned out, Hong Kong had a high degree of autonomy and freedom for longer than some of the pessimists expected. But then with the demonstrations came a crushing crackdown and new laws with which Beijing signalled, this is not going to happen again. You are not going to trash this incredible city, this financial centre, and embarrass us on the world stage with these extremes of public destruction and violence. And so there's another really interesting question that arises from that. Would there have been any need for a national security law with all of the screw tightening that came with that if it had not been for the incredibly destructive, futile protests that damaged thousands of businesses, that destroyed Hong Kong's economy for some time, ruined tourism market, contributed to a multi-year decline in property prices? Would any of it have happened but for those protests, which achieved absolutely nothing? It's a terrible shame because Hong Kong may have got another decade of relative freedoms as a result if it hadn't been for what happened in 2019. And for true believers like Jimmy Lai, it's a personal tragedy. Jimmy Lai could have left Hong Kong pretty much any time until his arrest in 2020. There were no restrictions on his movements. He's a British citizen. He's a very wealthy man. He owns properties around the world. He could have gone. Perhaps he realised that there was a high risk he would be arrested, charged and prosecuted, and a risk he was prepared to take because he so believed in his cause.
Hedley Thomas, thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire.
Hedley Thomas is the Australian's national chief correspondent. You can find his latest podcast, Sick to Death, which is an investigation into a killer surgeon, right now at sicktodeathpodcast.com and wherever you're listening. Plus, check out all our reporting of the rolling Hong Kong story anytime at theaustralian.com.au.